A small-town cop publicly shamed a black man, believing he was just another out-of-place stranger. What Officer Morris didn't realize was that his target wasn't just anyone. He was Judge Allen Edwards, the man who would hold his career in his hands the very next day. In a courtroom charged with tension, secrets unravel, and the scales of justice tremble under the weight of systemic prejudice and personal reckoning. The choice Morris faces will shake even those who think they've seen it all. But let's start at the beginning. Officer Bradley Morris prided himself on being a figure of authority in the small suburban town he served. Known for his no-nonsense approach, Morris believed he was maintaining order, though his methods often lacked compassion or understanding. On a slow weekday afternoon, he patrolled the bustling main square, a mix of small shops, cafes, and pedestrians going about their business. The scene was calm, almost mundane, until his eyes locked onto what he perceived as an anomaly: a well-dressed black man standing near the intersection. The man, holding a sleek leather briefcase and sipping from a coffee cup, occasionally glanced at his phone. To most, he would appear like a professional waiting for a meeting or a ride. To Morris, however, something about the man felt out of place. His internal bias, though unspoken, painted the man's ordinary actions as suspicious. "Hey," Morris barked, striding toward the man with a hand hovering over his holstered weapon. His loud tone caused a few heads to turn. "What are you doing here? You can't just loiter around like that." Startled, the man looked up, his expression a mix of confusion and composure. "I'm just waiting for my ride," he replied evenly. "Is there a problem, officer?" Morris, interpreting the calm response as arrogance, felt his irritation spike. "Problem is, this isn't a spot for waiting around. Show me your ID," he demanded, his voice firm and rising. The man hesitated briefly, furrowing his brow. "Am I under suspicion for something?" he asked, his tone steady but measured. The question only fueled Morris's anger. A few passers-by paused, forming a small, curious crowd. Feeling the need to assert his authority, Morris raised his voice. "I said, show me your ID, unless you want to ride downtown." Reluctantly, the man handed over his identification. "There's no need to raise your voice. I'm Judge Allen Edwards." Morris glanced at the ID, barely registering the name or title. With a smirk, he tossed it back. "Yeah, well, maybe you're judge of loitering. Don't think your title gives you a free pass." His tone was dripping with condescension. Judge Edwards slid his ID back into his wallet, his face calm, but his dignity wounded. "Officer," he said quietly, "you're overstepping your authority. I'll be leaving now." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked away. Morris watched him leave, a self-satisfied grin spreading across his face. "Yeah, walk away," he muttered, oblivious to the reckoning that awaited him. The next morning, Officer Bradley Morris strode into the courthouse with his typical confidence, his uniform crisp, and his badge polished to a shine. He was scheduled to testify in a case involving a young black man accused of resisting arrest. Morris felt no apprehension about his role. He believed his testimony was airtight and would secure the conviction with ease. After all, he had been the arresting officer and saw the case as straightforward. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs as Morris entered. He greeted a few familiar faces with a curt nod before making his way to the prosecution table. However, as he glanced toward the bench, his steps faltered and his stomach dropped. There, seated with an air of composed authority, was Judge Allen Edwards, the very man Morris had humiliated in public the day before. The judge's black robe only emphasized his commanding presence. For a moment, Morris stood frozen, his mind struggling to reconcile the man he had disrespected with the powerful figure before him. Edwards's gaze met Morris's, holding it firmly. His expression was unreadable. Neither anger nor amusement flickered in his eyes. After a beat of silence that felt like an eternity to Morris, Judge Edwards leaned forward slightly, his tone calm, yet firm. "Officer Morris," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. "You may take your seat. We're about to begin." Morris's usual confidence wavered as he lowered himself into his chair. His movements were mechanical, his mind racing. Would Judge Edwards use this opportunity to exact some kind of retribution? Would his career, built on his reputation as a firm enforcer of the law, now be at risk because of a single impulsive moment? He felt his throat tighten as the enormity of his mistake settled in. The courtroom, once a place where Morris felt entirely in control, now felt stifling and oppressive. His badge, which had always been a source of pride, now seemed to weigh heavily on his chest. As the trial began, Morris was no longer the self-assured officer he had been only moments before. Instead, he was a man desperately trying to navigate the consequences of his actions under the sharp scrutiny of a judge he had underestimated. As the proceedings commenced, the courtroom settled into a hushed focus. Judge Allen Edwards presided with a calm and measured demeanor, his impartiality evident in every gesture. For Officer Bradley Morris, however, the serenity of the judge only heightened his discomfort. The events of the previous day lingered in his mind like a dark cloud, and the weight of his actions seemed to press harder with each passing moment. When it was time for Morris to testify, he stood and walked to the witness stand, his usual confidence notably absent. He adjusted his uniform nervously and took the oath, feeling the intense scrutiny of both the defense attorney and, most notably, Judge Edwards. "Officer Morris," the defense attorney began, his tone professional but probing, "can you recount the events leading up to my client's arrest?" Morris hesitated, then began to speak. His voice was steady at first, but as the defense attorney asked follow-up questions, he began to falter. Details that had seemed clear in his initial report now felt muddled under the attorney's scrutiny. The attorney pounced on the inconsistencies, questioning timelines, motives, and Morris's interpretation of the defendant's actions. The tension mounted when Judge Edwards finally intervened. His tone was composed, but carried a pointed authority. "Officer, please ensure your testimony is accurate. This court requires integrity." The words struck Morris harder than a reprimand. He froze momentarily, his gaze dropping to his hands. For the first time, he felt the full weight of his actions, not just in this case, but in how he had wielded his authority over the years. His attempts to regain his composure were shaky at best. As the trial drew to a close, Judge Edwards delivered his decision with deliberate care. He cited insufficient evidence and highlighted the need for fairness and justice in every case. The defendant was acquitted, and the courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the gavel struck. Morris sat frozen, the realization sinking in. The judge's professionalism had spared him direct humiliation, but the unspoken message was clear. Integrity was not optional, and accountability was unavoidable. After the courtroom emptied, Morris approached Edwards, his arrogance replaced by an uncharacteristic humility. "Judge Edwards, I just wanted to apologize for yesterday. I didn't realize." Edwards cut him off. "You didn't realize who I was, officer. But that's the point, isn't it? You shouldn't need to know someone's title to treat them with basic respect." Morris nodded, the weight of Edwards's words settling in. "You're right. I was out of line. I need to do better." Edwards regarded him for a moment before nodding. "We all do." Change starts with accountability. Have a good day, officer. As Morris left the courthouse, he felt a shift within himself, a small but meaningful step toward reflection and growth. For the first time, he understood that his badge didn't absolve him of humanity, but rather demanded it. Edwards watched him go, hopeful that the lesson would stick. The justice system, he knew, was far from perfect, but moments like this, however small, were the beginnings of change.